So, a warm welcome to our fourth session of the CPD course. This is our fourth and last session. So, every time we had a course, I was in a different place. The first time I was at the office of IFSW, second at my political office in Lucerne, and then third time at my paid job in Bern as a social work practitioner. But this day, I'm really excited to be at the OHCHR office in Geneva. So the background you see doesn't look that special, but the office is really special, and so I'm really thankful that we can have our last session here. As you could see, the program is focusing on Indigenous peoples' rights. And we are going to have wonderful speakers deepening this topic with you. And then we end up the course as we began with Pradit Weigel and Rory Truell, who will have a final discussion on the topics that arise during this course and how we continue. Much looking forward to all of that. If you have any questions, thoughts, concerns, contribution, use the chat box, and trying to implement all of that you're mentioning there. Rin is not with us. She's traveling. But she has a deputy who is Yu. Yu is just next to Rory, and here you can see her. Thank you, Yu. She told me that she has begun her intern 2 weeks ago, and she's already so supportive for us. So thank you so much. In every session, we had a short look back on the last session, and I want to share a few information what we had last time. We had a wonderful presentation from Rose Henderson, who gave us some insight on the commission that IFSW is launching. And then we also had 2 social workers who have spoken about their experience as social work practitioners. That was Sonali Owen and Bianca Yasmin Anglo. And what I really found striking is that Rose mentioned the previous topics that we see as social workers, as duty bearers, as human rights holders, human rights defenders. And in order to fulfill this role, they need to have their own rights respected. And if social workers can really see their rights respected, then they can provide better care, better service, and better support for communities and the people they work with. So we could well link all those points together. That was really amazing to see. So we had these roles as social workers, as human rights holders, duty bearers, enablers of human rights, and catalysts for human rights, and human rights defenders. And I think we are going to deepen this discussion later on with our colleagues here, and you might also write some thoughts that you have on these different roles that we have. But now let me pass the word to our presenters. First, we have Arturo Requesens, and you will give us some insights from OHCHR perspective. I'm not the one who speaks a lot about the person who is presenting. I prefer that every one of you can say a few words, who you are and what links you to this topic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prisca, and thank you so much, Doria and colleagues, for being here and for listening to us and for attending this session. It is a real pleasure for OHCHR to be able to partner with IFSW on this training, because we believe that it's quite relevant for us to work together. Very briefly, I'm a human rights lawyer. I started my career in Mexico, and I've been already for around 17 years working at the United Nations in the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I really don't want to say more about myself, and I would like to go more into the substance. as I know that the time that we have is quite limited. So if you allow me, I'm going to be sharing my screen. You can see it, right? Now? Yeah, all good. Excellent. Okay, well, let's then go in a little bit more into the substance. I will explain very briefly what we understand of what is our understanding of indigenous peoples, give a brief comments on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, explain a little bit the work of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and the specific work of our office. Currently, I'm working in the Indigenous Peoples and Minorities section of OHHR in Geneva. I've been working here for a year and a half. Okay, well, in relation to indigenous peoples, it is estimated that there's a population of more than 476 million in more than 90 countries, which is basically more or less like 5% of the total population around the world, with more than 5,000 distinct peoples. Indigenous peoples have a lot of diversity in terms of languages. Actually, they speak the most of the languages around the world. It is calculated by UNESCO that there are around 7,500 languages in total in the world. Indigenous peoples speak around 4,000 languages. Many of them, as you can imagine, they are just basically a small group of people talking, because unfortunately, indigenous peoples, due to colonization and many other factors, as you are aware, have been suffering and struggling in many occasions to survive. Indigenous peoples are very important because, well, one of their characteristics that they have a lot of cultural diversity and knowledge of the world. As you know, they have a lot of their traditional knowledges in terms of plants, land, and medicines, that it's really rich. And unfortunately, something that I have to say is that many Western cultures have not valued historically all the knowledge, all the culture, and all the history of indigenous peoples. And that's why it's been easier for many of them to consider themselves superior to indigenous peoples, which is, of course, a misconception of the reality. I have to say that there is not as such a universal definition of indigenous peoples, and there's been a lot of thinking about who are indigenous peoples and who are not indigenous peoples, because in many countries they are not called indigenous peoples. In Asia or in Africa, they might be called ethnic minorities, tribal people, or many other different terminologies. So the term indigenous peoples as such is not universal, and there's no definition, but there is a study produced in 1981 that it's quite famous, that it's called the Martinez-Cobo study, which defined somehow indigenous communities as peoples and nations of which have a historical continuity with the pre-invasion and pre-colonial societies that developed on their territories. They consider themselves distinct from other sectors of society, forms a non-dominant sector of society in most of the countries, are determined, to preserve, develop, and transmit to future generations their ancestral territories, their distinct ethnic identity, as the basis of their continued existence as peoples in accordance with their own cultural patterns, social institutions, and legal systems. That is a definition used at some point in 1981, but as I said, there is not as such definition. The participation, just very briefly, of indigenous peoples at the United Nations has been really important, and it started in 1920s with a visit of a chief, Descartes, from the Uruguay nation, who wanted basically, who came to the League of Nations, who was the institution that preceded the United Nations, who wanted to his nation to be recognized by the United Nations and by the United States. And unfortunately, at that moment, it was not even received by the League of Nations. Historically, it's a movement that has fortunately gained a lot of space at the United Nations, and with the time and with the effort, especially since the 1980s, it was possible to establish a working group on indigenous populations that drafted one of the main instruments on indigenous peoples at the United Nations, which is called the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This instrument took more than 20 years of negotiation, was adopted by the General Assembly, and here I posted a link to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. You can access it and read it carefully, because unfortunately we won't have time to go through all the declaration. The declaration, I have to say, is the most advanced and comprehensive international instruments on indigenous people's rights. There are others. There is a treaty, a convention, that it's called the 169 International Labor Convention on Indigenous Peoples and Tribal Peoples. This was adopted before, however, the declaration that I'm referring is the most advanced and comprehensive. And something important of this instrument is that was negotiated and there was an active participation of indigenous peoples in the drafting of the document. Although might some argue that it's not a legally binding document, most of the content of this declaration is based on other treaties, such as the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, the International Convention of Economical, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the mentioned 169 Convention of the International Labour Organization. This declaration is taken as a framework in the work of most, I would say, UN mechanisms on human rights. It is also used by states to develop policies as well as by UN entities. It is used, for example, by UN tribunals, although it might not be considered legally binding. It is taken into consideration its content at the national level. It is also used, and this is very important for social workers, because you are a very important stakeholder here. You are a bridge between indigenous peoples and governments in many occasions. And this declaration is used politically by indigenous peoples and those who are supporting indigenous peoples in their daily relationship with the governments. For example, we're just talking to Prisca and Dori, and I was explaining them that the United Nations tried to support the development, for example, of national policies on indigenous peoples, or in many occasions, social workers as this bridge between indigenous peoples and governments should know the content of the declaration, because in any negotiation related to any specific issue to indigenous peoples, there are already principles that should be respected by governments. Something in particular that we were just discussing right now, Prisca and Dori, was the fact that indigenous peoples have their own specific views of their development. In many occasions, governments or companies want to bring development to indigenous peoples according to their own concept of development. And the UN Declaration of Indigenous Peoples is very clear that development activities should be conducted according to indigenous peoples' priorities. Something really important of the declaration, it's also the recognition of indigenous peoples' institutions, because we have to remember that indigenous peoples in most of the places have their own government institutions. and they have health systems, educational systems that should be respected. And the particular views of governments or companies on development or any other issue should always respect indigenous people's views and priorities. I really don't have a lot of time to go very deep into the declaration. I would suggest you to read it through. But some of the basic rights and the most important issues contained in the declaration is, for example, the right to self-determination, which is linked to what I just mentioned, basically, that indigenous peoples have the possibility to determine their own priorities, to determine their own identity, and to basically decide their own ways of developing and also to have their structures and institutions respected according to their own procedures. Some other important rights that are included in the declarations include the right of decision making, which is basically also more related to the right of self-determination. The fact that they should not be discriminated by any means, which is unfortunately still happening in many countries. The right over lands, territories, and resources, which, as you know, is also one of the main priorities for indigenous peoples, because historically they've been dispossessed of their lands, territories, and resources. The right to development, according to their own priorities, the right to education, and well, many other rights that are important, including, of course, health, the right to housing, and one of the most important issues and rights affirmed in the declaration is the right to free, prior, and informed consent, which I'm just going to make as a short statement, because basically the idea of the free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples include the fact that any specific policy, law, or act that might be affecting indigenous people's rights should have been freely, prior, informed to indigenous peoples, and they should give their consent. This is super important, as unfortunately they've been historically, as I said, victims of imposition of schools, of religions, of beliefs which are not according to their own cultures. I just want to mention very briefly, because I know that I'm running out of time, that there's one of the main mechanisms on indigenous peoples is the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. This is a body that works in New York that has an annual session, and it holds sessions every year during 2 weeks. The mandate of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues is to discuss economic and social development, culture, environment, education, health, and human rights. So it might, for some people, have a broader perspective than only human rights instruments. So basically, this mechanism tries also to look at more social and economic issues and development. They make recommendations to member states and to UN entities on how to improve all these areas of work according to the rights established in the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This mechanism is integrated, is composed by 8 members nominated by governments and 8 nominated by indigenous peoples. As you know, the United Nations is a space of dialogue between indigenous, in this case, between indigenous peoples and member states. So you can see that they're also not necessarily as such representative of governments, but some experts are nominated by government, so but they might be also representing more the interest of governments rather than only the rights of indigenous peoples. So there's a lot of negotiation ongoing in the adoption of specific recommendations. I would just want to say something before concluding that we were discussing right now with Priska. As social workers, I think you have a really important role on learning about, well, first of all, learning about all the declaration and the instruments, because you are in direct contact in many occasions with indigenous peoples. You can be a source of information for them, but you can also encourage them to participate and to learn more about the different instruments at the United Nations. You can also advocate without necessarily being a lawyer, and you can present claims or situations to different United Nations mechanisms on the rights of indigenous peoples that do not require as such to be to have a law degree or to be a professional. It's about the United Nations system is quite open, but sometimes also technical. I encourage you to try to go deeper into any study on the declaration and on the mechanisms. And as I was talking to Priska and to Dori, we can also elaborate a little bit deeper if you consider it necessary. I don't want to take more time because I already think that I exhausted my time, and I also think that my colleagues have a lot of more information to share. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Arturo. Actually, you're right on time. It's just 15 minutes sharp. So thank you so much. A wonderful introduction and information about the system. And I'm passing the word now to your colleague, Atina. And I know Atina has sent me some information about her background. So I'm asking you to just say who you are and what links you to indigenous peoples and the role that you have in OHCHR. And I know that you also have a presentation you're going to share with us, so hope it works. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Priska, for this time, and also thank you, colleagues, and good morning to everyone. Maybe for some it must be morning, some afternoon, and the others maybe evening as well. So thank you for this opportunity, and I'm very happy to take this time and also to share about the indigenous rights mechanism in particular today. So I'm gonna talk about that, but before that, just a little brief about myself. As Priska said, I'm Atina Pamaigore, and I belong to an indigenous group called Naga Indigenous Peoples from the northeast of India. So I'm also working together with Arturo here at the headquarters of the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights in Geneva, and work for the Indigenous Peoples and Minorities section, and I support the mandates of the Expert Mechanism on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That's about me. And so just to go straight to the presentation, I have here my presentation. I hope everyone can see.
It went away, so I have it on, so you can just say me when I should go to the next slide.
Oh yeah, okay, perfect. Thank you, Priska. So first of all, I will talk about the Expert Mechanism on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It is a subsidiary body of the Human Rights Council, and it was established in 2007 by the Human Rights Council resolutions, and its mandate was amended in 2016, again by Human Rights resolutions. So we can move to the next one. Just a little bit more on what does it says about the mandate. This mandate okay, going back a little bit on the history, MRIP is in short the expert mechanism on rights of indigenous people. So it was established, as I said, in 2007 after the dissolution of the working group on indigenous peoples. Also, as my colleague has presented about how the UNDRIP evolved and took 20 years to get it adopted. So in that process, during that time, there was a working group on indigenous populations. But after the adoption of the UNDRIP, the Human Rights Commission established this mechanism called the MRIP. And then following that, the Human Rights Council, which take over the Human Rights Commission in 2007, adopted a resolution whereby this mechanism is created as its subsidiary body to provide the council with thematic expertise on the rights of indigenous peoples. And then, so the main mandates is to assist Human Rights Council by giving thematic advice on the rights of indigenous peoples. And this is carried out in the form of studies and research. So we have annual thematic studies and also reports. So this is one of the main activities or under the mandate of the MRIP. And also proposals are submitted, suggestions, proposals to the Human Rights Councils for its consideration and approval is submitted. But then the MRIP is not a mechanism whereby it can adopt resolutions or make decisions in itself. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yes. As I said, this mandate was amended in 2016. So with the amended mandates of the MRIP, it has the Human Rights Council has given a new mandate to sort of assist member states and also indigenous peoples organizations to provide technical advice and guidance in terms of development of domestic legislations, policies relating to the rights of indigenous peoples, and also in the implementations of recommendations by various human rights mechanisms like the Universal Periodic Review, treaty bodies, and also special procedures like the special rapporteurs on the rights of indigenous peoples. And also it also facilitates dialogues when agreeable of all parties to achieve the ends of declaration. How this mandate is carried out is through country engagement. That is one of the main functions of the MRIP in the amended mandates. And just to also to say that MRIP is also responsible, its work is guided by the framework of the UNDRIP, where a lot more detail has been explained, and we will also be listening to the content of the UNDRIP in the implementations from the ground later from our colleagues. So as I said, this is MRIP is guided by the framework, and its main role is also to interpret and translate the UNDRIP for implementation in the ground. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yes. MRIP has annual sessions that is held every year in July for 5 days. And also it formally presents its work and studies on a yearly basis during the September session of the Human Rights Council. As I mentioned earlier, that we MRIP conduct thematic studies and reports. So the thematic studies comes with advice. So these studies would be presented during the September session of the Human Rights Council, since as I mentioned in the beginning that it is a subsidiary body of the Human Rights Council. So all the works has to go through the Human Rights Council. And that is how it works. And we, in terms of the composition, we have 7 independent experts representing 7 socio-cultural regions. So we have members from the North America, from the Pacific, from Eastern Europe, Russian Federation, Central Asia, and Transcaucasia. That is one region, and another from Asia, the Arctic, and also members representing the Central and South America and the Caribbean, and from Africa. So we have 7 independent experts of the MRIP, and their mandate is for 3 years, which is renewable for another term. Next, please. This year, we have the MRIP have a thematic study on constitutions, laws, legislations, policies, judicial decisions, and other mechanisms through which states have taken measures to achieve the ends of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's a very lengthy topic, but this is to examine, to analyze about the constitutions at the national level, legislations, etc., at the national level. And this thematic study will be discussed during the upcoming session in July. The next the session that is coming up is the 17th session, so it's from the 8th to the 12th of July. So this will be discussed during the session. And if we move to the next slide, please. Yes. And besides the thematic studies, there will also be discussions around conflict, post-conflict situation, and peace negotiations, agreements, and accords on the rights of indigenous peoples. And there will be another discussion around enhancing participations of indigenous peoples in the United Nations, followed by international decades of international languages. As we all know that there is a declaration, International Year of Indigenous Peoples of, and there is the International Decade of Indigenous Language ongoing that is spearheaded by UN agencies, the UNESCO. So MRIP also provides support in this process. And so there will be a dedicated discussion during this upcoming session. And here we added country engagement. There is always a discussion around country engagement for those countries that have been engaged with the MRIP. For example, there has been several countries in the past like New Zealand, Finland, and most recently Australia, Norway, where MRIP had an engagement mission. And during the session, there is a discussion to also learn about the experiences, lessons learned, and also follow up on what the government, the states, or the indigenous peoples organization themselves has carried out based on the technical advice that the expert mechanism provides. So this is also there will be also discussion around that. And besides that, participants can also request for side events that at the margin of the session, so that they can have their own parallel or side events. And participants including member states, indigenous organizations, national human rights institutions, NGOs with ECOSOC status, and NGOs working on indigenous issues, and also academia. They can also participate in the session. So there will be a floor, open floor provided for oral intervention, so during the plenary. So this is how participants or stakeholders can participate in our session. Can we go to the next one, please? Yes. As briefly mentioned, the participation is open to all the member states, indigenous organizations, NGOs, academia, national human rights institutions, and other stakeholders as observers. So it is open, and right now the registration or accreditation to the session is open, and you'll find this link here about the session and also the registration to the Indico. And for more details about MRIP and its work, you can also visit our website. Next slide, please. Just to summarize on how to engage and contribute to the expert mechanism on rights of indigenous peoples. First of all, one can present candidates as possible experts. So indigenous communities, organizations, or institutions usually also nominate, but again, this is an independent expert, so it can come from individual nomination as well, but most preferably, or as the practice goes, there are people who are indigenous themselves and also with knowledge about indigenous rights and their issues, and also preferably experiences working for or with the indigenous peoples of nations. So those are the ones who usually become experts. And then one can participate in the session, as I mentioned, and also participate in expert seminar and participate in the September session of the Human Rights Council, where there is a dedicated item panel for indigenous people's issues. And requests for country visits. I have not gotten very deeply in detail about the country visits, but the request for country visit can come from the member states or from indigenous organizations or other stakeholders. And then this will be negotiated or agreed upon by both the parties, and then the country engagement mission can take place. And also contribute to the study. So we usually send an open call for inputs, contributions to the study. So this is also where people can participate and contribute to the work of the MRIC. Next slide, please. We have had several thematic studies conducted over the years, not just study, but we also produce reports on the best practice of the implementation of UN DRIP. So we have had more than 19 documents that consist of the thematic studies as well as reports. So I just listed a few here on what we have done. So we have done the study on right to education of indigenous peoples, then right to languages and culture, the role of languages and culture, and also right to health, free prior informed consent, study on land rights, rights of indigenous children, and also the most recently, we have had the study on impact of militarizations on the rights of indigenous peoples. You will find all the study and report on our website, and you can in a downloadable form. So please feel free to visit our website for more details. Next slide, please. Yes. And now
sorry, Athena, we are running a little bit out of time.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay. I will be very quick. Thank you. So now coming to the special rapporteurs on the rights of indigenous peoples mandate, as it is appointed by the Commission on Human Rights in 2001 as part of the system of thematic special procedures of the human rights of the United Nations. And its mandate was renewed in 2007 by the Human Rights Council, and most recently in 2022, the mandate was renewed by a resolution. Next, please. Yes, so under the new mandates, the special rapporteurs on the rights of indigenous peoples can examine ways to overcome existing obstacles to the full and effective protection of the rights of indigenous peoples, to identify exchange and promote best practices. Also, he gather requests, receive and exchange information communications from all relevant sources, and also receive information on alleged violations and abuses of the rights of indigenous peoples. And the special rapporteurs formulate recommendations and proposals on appropriate measures and activities to prevent and remedy violations of the rights of indigenous peoples. And also the special rapporteur work closely in cooperation and coordination with other special procedures and subsidiary organs of the Human Rights Council, particularly with the MRIP and also with the Permanent Forum. Next, please. I will soon be over. So scope of work, it undertakes country visits and also receive act on individual cases of alleged violations and concerns of broader structural nature by sending communications to states. And it conducts thematic studies also and convened expert consultations. And it engages in advocacy and raise public awareness and also provide technical cooperation. You may also, next slide, please. You may also visit the okay, before that, the special rapporteurs also report annually to the sessions of Human Rights Council that generally happen in September every year, and to the General Assembly in New York. Next slide. So the mandate holder, current mandate holder is Mr. Kali Chai. He is a Maya Cacique from Guatemala, and you may reach him at this email and also visit the webpage of the special rapporteurs, and you'll find a lot more information there, and also you will also be able to see what are the thematic studies that he has conducted. So this is all from my side. I'm sorry for taking a lot more time, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Athena. We would probably all love to hear more. And congratulations to have this special rapporteur on Indigenous people's rights. I think that's a big achievement and so important for all your work. And also a way to access for us as social workers to get involved in this mechanism. Thank you so much. We are now moving on to the social work perspective. We have Hilary Weaver, who is with IFSW UN Commission together with Margareta. And so you started the presentation already, so pass the word to you. Thank you.
Good morning, Kihani Washte. Good afternoon, good evening. Let me see if I can just get to the right place to start my presentation. And slideshow beginning. So I am Hilary Weaver. I am the Global Indigenous Commissioner for the International Federation of Social Workers. If anybody is interested in following up after the presentation, there's my contact information. I'm going to be speaking about the promise and the limitations of UN DRIP, specifically within the US context. And let's see if I can advance my slides though. So, my slides do not seem to be advancing. Priska, I might need you to advance as you did for the last one.
Okay, okay. Yes, I will. Just give me a moment. You go, oh, okay. And then, so you can continue to speak and then I start your presentation soon.
Yes, when you bring it up, go ahead to the second slide.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll introduce myself. I am Lakota. I live in Haudenosaunee territory, which is the same group that Arturo spoke about, who appealed to the League of Nations and was turned away. I have lived in Haudenosaunee territory most of my adult life, and I am a social worker. As I mentioned, I am also the Global Indigenous Commissioner for the International Federation of Social Workers. That group is an accredited NGO with the United Nations, and we have made that a priority to attend the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, where I believe we are the only social work organization who is regularly participating. We have regional representatives from each of the 5 regions recognized by IFSW, which is Europe, Africa, Asia Pacific, Latin America and the Caribbean, and North America. Looks like my slides are about to load, hopefully. I'm going to be speaking with you today. I'm going to give a quick overview of both the UNDRIP's promise, limitations, how it has been applied. I've got 2 quick case studies from the United States, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about moving forward. And hopefully my PowerPoint comes up soon, because I think I just tried to say what was on my second slide, but I
here
don't
now
remember.
it comes. Now it comes. Okay, here you go. Okay, you should see it now.
You need to be at the beginning. You're on slide 16.
Yep, but then it works. Okay, hold on. Sorry for that.
This is a test for the audience to see if we can do everything backwards.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's always a test to see how technology works.
And how good social workers are in technology also.
Yes, well, I will say I am not good at technology, but there
So
we
as
are.
you can see, neither am I. So but we are here. So I'm at the first slide. So okay.
We are here.
Where to
Go
go?
ahead and advance.
Uh-huh.
So I think I covered that, who I am and who the Indigenous Commission is. So UNDRIP is a very promising framework. It outlines the rights that are really the minimum standards for Indigenous peoples. I do want to be clear that it does not create new rights. It elaborates on human rights principles and it applies them to Indigenous peoples. And a theme throughout my presentation is going to be that these standards connect to existing state obligations. So again, it's not new, but it's articulating these standards. Next slide, please. So some of the limitations, particularly here in North America, there's a lot of concern that the UNDRIP focuses on the rights of Indigenous peoples within settler states. Some of you might not think of that as controversial, but a lot of the people here in the United States and North America, like the Haudenosaunee people, do not fully accept citizenship in settler states. You know, UNDRIP, as was pointed out, talks about free, prior, informed consent. Well, Indigenous people in the United States were conferred with citizenship in 1924, but nobody asked us. Many people don't want that. So a lot of people here still see treaties as a better mechanism because it is government to government rather than Indigenous peoples within settler states. Some other limitations of UNDRIP: states are really supposed to take these measures to implement UNDRIP. That can include legislation or other concrete, substantive, affirmative measures to address the inequities that Indigenous people experience within settler states. It's a should. It's something that states should do, and some have done that. But others continue to argue that UNDRIP is not legally binding. Some even say it carries no moral, political, or legal obligations. I refer you to the report of the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples because it's really got some good stuff in there about what has been implemented. Next slide, please. Quick overview of places that have implemented UN DRIP. A number of countries like Ecuador, Bolivia, and Kenya have incorporated it in their constitutions. Chile is an interesting example. They tried to implement it in their new constitution. They had 17 indigenous representatives working on the new constitution, but when it came to the referendum, the new constitution was turned down. In Canada, a province, British Columbia, passed a Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, and later the federal government of Canada incorporated something similar. Other places like New Zealand and Mexico have established their own plans for justice for Indigenous peoples, and some courts even consider UN DRIP in their decisions. So some places are really trying to do this. Next slide, please. But now we come to the unfortunate example of the United States. As I mentioned, UN DRIP really requires positive engagement and collaboration between the states and Indigenous peoples for the state to pass legislation that affirms these rights. And while the neighbors of the United States have done so, Canada and Mexico were both listed on the last slide as integrating some or all of UN DRIP. I will also mention that Indigenous people preceded these settler states. I can walk to Canada from my house. Haudenosaunee people are on both sides of this imaginary border between the US and Canada. A lot of the work that Mexico is highlighting around their work with Indigenous people is with the Yaqui people, who are also in the United States as a federally recognized tribe. The US has largely failed to incorporate UN DRIP. And so I've got that picture in the middle of a flag flying upside down is a distress signal. Next slide, please. So as was mentioned previously, 143 countries voted in favor of UN DRIP in 2007. That map in the corner shows who did not vote for UN DRIP, including Anglo settler states, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. In 2011, President Obama of the United States finally said that the US will support UN DRIP. I think they were trying to be careful around language. Some things I've seen said, you know, don't think we're endorsing it, we're supporting it. And in that announcement, he still says it's not legally binding. So the United States is quite ambivalent at best about the UN DRIP. I think it's also important to point out that Native Americans have very different understandings and expressions of sovereignty. We are not one group. So the way that Haudenosaunee people experience sovereignty here in the eastern part of the continent is very different than the way that the Lakota in the Great Plains or people of the Southwest experience sovereignty. We are very different people. We do continue to employ our own tribal legal traditions. Some people will say that that is applying provisions of the UN DRIP, but again, our own traditions precede UN DRIP. Although I will say that even though the United States is not fully on board with UN DRIP, and some indigenous nations say we should use the treaties more than the international mechanism, the language of UN DRIP, especially free, prior, informed consent, is commonly used among Native Americans. Next slide, please. I'm going to give you two quick case examples. First, the famous one, the No DAPL movement. Many of you may remember this was very visible in 2016, got a lot of international attention. The Dakota Access Pipeline threatened the water supply, not just for Lakota people, but for anybody who drinks water. The water supply was threatened as this pipeline passed by Standing Rock Reservation and in territory that was guaranteed to us by the Fort Laramie Treaty forever. Not only was there the pipeline that pipelines leak, but it destroyed burial sites and sacred places. Representatives from Standing Rock went to Geneva. They used these UN mechanisms. They appealed that the pipeline violates human rights. They also argued it's a breach of treaties, but they very much invoked the UN DRIP. Of course, by 2017, oil was flowing through the pipeline. So we called for assistance, we got attention, but ultimately we still struggle. Next slide, please. And a current example that you may not have heard of, the Tonawanda Band of Senecas are part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy here where I live in New York State. There is a science, technology, and advanced manufacturing park known as STAMP. They also have a pipeline for wastewater. They are doing drilling in a wildlife refuge right next to the tribal territory. This is an active problem. The chief has stood up and said this is threatening our hunting, our fishing, our gathering medicine, our food. But here in Haudenosaunee territory, you do not hear them using UN language. You hear them referring to the treaty rights and internal federal remedies. The picture is of treaty wampum belts, our original understandings with the settlers who came to this land from Europe. And people still see these treaties as living documents. So they're appealing to US mechanisms. The federal government in the United States has a trust responsibility to Indigenous peoples. That's what they're appealing to. Next slide, please. So as we move forward, we can't just be passive. UN DRIP is important, whether we fully embrace it or not, whether our settler states fully embrace it or not. The key challenge to implementation is lack of political will. That's what you see in the United States. Even though we now say we support it, you see the ambivalence. But the governments of settler states are made up of people who have constituents. We can influence these governments, particularly those of you who are not Indigenous people, can influence your own governments. That's how change happens, when it's academia, the media, the arts, religious groups, NGOs, the business community standing up and saying, governments, you need to support the rights of Indigenous peoples. These institutions, these NGOs can do advocacy, can do lobbying, can raise awareness. And when you look at who is doing this work, you hear a lot about the legal community and academia fostering accountability. I want to hear more about social workers calling for accountability. This is what we as social workers do. We are advocates. We can stand up and hold settler states accountable for UN DRIP as well as treaty rights. Next slide, please. So, quick summary. Your takeaway from my part of the presentation, please remember UN DRIP affirms, it does not give rights, and it affirms the rights within settler societies. Not all Indigenous peoples are fully comfortable with being part of settler societies. Not all states are willing to do anything about UN DRIP. Even those who implement it in things like their constitutions, that must be monitored so we know that it is more than just lip service, that it is true implementation. regardless of what settler states do, as Indigenous people, we continue to assert our own sovereignty and self-determination, but that looks different for different Indigenous peoples. We do it to greater or lesser extents. And again, legal professionals and academics are advocating for UN DRIP. Social workers can and must do so as well. Next slide, please. I thank you. Pilamaya means thank you in my Lakota language. You can advance the slide and turn it over to my colleague.
Thank you so much, Hilary. That was a powerful presentation. And Margarita, you can also just say when I have to move to the next slide, and now it works with the slides. Okay.
Thank you. Berarade, good morning. Berebjeve, yeberekede. Hello and good evening. Monomele merke kalberoche, monele brigade me soarsane up me en samelanta. My name is Margareta Kalberucek, and I'm Umesami, and that was my mother tongue, Umesami language, one of 5 acknowledged Sami languages in Sweden. I'm the European Commissioner in IFSW Indigenous Commission. I'm also a PhD and an associate professor at Department of Social Work at Umeå University in Sweden, also in Umeå Sami area, closer to the coast. I was actually born and grew up close to the mountains in Umeå Sami area, and this is my family's and ancestors' land since time immemorial. I'm also a professional social worker and have been previously working as a social worker for more than 30 years in a Swedish social work system. Next slide, please. And today I'm going to talk about the previous one, please. Yes, I'm going to talk about Swedish social welfare and Sami issues in Swedish social welfare, and with examples from my research on such issues. The Swedish social welfare is part of and included in the Nordic welfare system. This Nordic welfare system is similar in the Nordic countries, and they have collaborations between the countries here, but it's not the same system, and partly due to different legislations in the different countries. The social welfare system is based on social politics and political structure. Next slide, please. The Swedish social welfare system is based on equality, that all citizens shall have the same rights. It's also based on solidarity, that vulnerable groups and individuals shall be supported by the whole society, mostly financed by taxes. And it's also based on freedom to speak, to write, and to have your own religion. Next slide, please. And this concept of same rights has for a long time been interpreted with the good intentions, as all individuals shall have the same right and shall have the same treatment. Next slide, please. And further, Sweden has adopted the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And Sweden also acknowledged the Sami people as indigenous people in 1977. In 1993, we had the Sami Parliament in Sweden. It's a Swedish state authority. And the Sami Parliament in Sweden is represented by representatives from Sami political parties elected by the Sami people. And this is unlike other Swedish state authorities, which are represented by their employees. Next slide, please. Since 2011, the Sami people's rights as indigenous people are adopted in the Swedish fundamental law. And these rights are about rights to self-determination and to have social, economic, and political institutions related to land and water. And although it's not obviously stated, I can see that as related to UNDRIP. However, the free, prior, and informed consent is not obviously documented in the fundamental law. Next slide, please. The Sami people is also a national minority in Sweden, as are 4 other minorities who have been living in Sweden for a long time. These rights are stated in the Act on National Minorities and Minority Languages from 2009 and in accordance with an European Convention on Rights of Minorities. Next slide, please. Sami rights as indigenous are more far-reaching and stronger than rights as a national minority. However, Sami rights as indigenous, with accordance to UNDRIP, have sometimes been mixed up with national minority rights, and sometimes that have led to marginalization of Sami rights as indigenous. Next slide, please. All welfare services in Sweden are run by the state, regional counties, and/or local municipalities with autonomy regarding financials and services. And there are no specific Sami welfare system. There are some Sami NGOs and private initiatives among Sami regarding social issues. Next slide, please. The Sami people are not a vulnerable group per se, which I want to pinpoint. And that is regarding vulnerable groups as defined in Swedish social work, like persons with disability, persons with addictive problems, and children at risk. However, some individuals can be vulnerable in vulnerable situations, and if so, they have rights to have service and support from welfare system according to current legislations and as indigenous according to UNDRIP. But the concept of same rights has sometimes been an argument for not regarding same Sami rights as indigenous. Next slide, please. Measures in social welfare, social work included, are mostly based on mainstream society and often on the concept of same rights for all. Measures, services in social services and healthcare that are based on Sami society and individuals are scarce or lacking. Next slide, please. The concept of same rights for all can to some extent explain, despite good intentions from beginning, lack of Sami relevant measures. And that can lead to hard being heard for all Sami, and especially for children, older Sami, and women with disabilities, and Sami women subjected to domestic violence. And that can also lead to withdrawal from healthcare and other social welfare measures. And interviewees has told me that they also want more Sami social workers as specialists in social services and healthcare. Next slide, please. When Sami relevant measures were lacking, Sami individuals could be supported by family, other close ones, and friends. And resilience among Sami could be identified, supported by their families and society. Some few single examples also showed how Sami relevant measures could be developed when professionals regarded the Sami individuals' needs and expressed by the Sami themselves. And this can be seen as future possibilities within existing legislations. Next slide, please. And my conclusions are that special considerations are needed regarding measures and services offered to Sami individuals in vulnerable situations. For example, women and children that are subjected to violence and Sami with disabilities. And the Sami rights to speak for themselves should be regarded. increased Sami relevant measures offered to Sami in social welfare services regarding Sami self-determination, life situation, language and culture are needed. And also Sami social workers' knowledges and competence from within should be uprated and stated as specialized competence of importance in social welfare system. Next slide, please. Sweden has received comments from international experts. And for example, in 2007, regarding Sami women's rights to service and support when subjected to domestic violence. And recommendations to Sweden were about the importance to regard Sami women's needs as indigenous in welfare state system. In 2017, the EU Expert Committee on Minority Rights stated that Sami rights as indigenous were not enough regarded. For example, importance of relation to land and water among non-reindeer herding Sami as indigenous, which I can see as related to UNDRIP. In 2018, Sweden was recommended to increase Sami representation in matters that concern them as indigenous by the EU Expert Committee on Minority Rights. Next slide, please. In January 2020, the Supreme Court in Sweden decided that the Sami village Girjas has exclusive right to grant fishing and hunting in the reindeer pasture due to history and tradition. And this can be seen as one example of Girjas' strengthened right to self-determination and related to UNDRIP. However, the state did not acknowledge Sami ownership of the land. Unfortunately, after that court case, the number of reported hate crimes addressed at Sami and especially reindeer herding Sami has increased, and the case has been reflected among public in mainstream society and often in social media. Next slide, please. In 2022, an act on consultation with the Sami people in matters that concern them was adopted. And this legislation is aiming at strengthening Sami rights to self-determination. And that can also be seen as related to UNDRIP. And this legislation can be seen as possibilities for the future, even though voices about needs to develop the implementation of this legislation have been raised. Next slide, please. And these are references you can look at later. And next slide, please. With that, I want to thank Gitu, which is thanks in my language. Thanks for your attention.
So thank you so much, Margareta and Hilary, for this social work view on Indigenous people's rights. And we could also see that all of those concerns of Indigenous people, like pipelines and all of that, is important for also social work. So now you see, like Rory and Paddy, they're coming on my side. We just decided that they're coming here. So we can also, yes, they can also see us over there. So I'm thinking I'm going right here, and Paddy, and you take it. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So hello everyone. Okay, thank you so much. I know that Paddy and Rory, they're really busy and have taken the time for having this session here, and so valuable. So have you both here with us, and also we have Arturo with us, and you, who thank you so much. So this is the last part of this course, and as we have begun with Rory and Paddy 4 weeks ago, I would also like to end this course with the two of them and having a short discussion. You can also raise your questions that you have for the two of them, put that in the chat. But my question to begin with is, Rory and Paddy, if you now have seen this course, these 4 sessions, and it's actually an initial course that we always try to bring OHCHR and IFSW together. I wonder, how you see further projects and collaboration, and I'll pass it to you.
Oh, me?
Either way. Fine.
Sure, thank you. I don't know if I'm on here, but let me show myself. First, thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me. It was great to see you all 4 weeks ago, and great to see you now. I've been following the discussions, including this morning, and which has been very, very useful. Not only for me, I'm sure it's been useful for you, but it was also useful for me to hear all these dynamic views, experience from the ground, engagement with multiple stakeholders, duty bearers, right holders, and so on. So in terms of going forward, first and foremost, I think it was an excellent beginning. So we have to acknowledge that. It's always important to look at what are the areas that we can work together in the future. There's so many areas that we have in common. Of course, the part that I come from in OHCHR are economic, social, and cultural rights, which are very similar to what many of you do, such as promoting social security, advocating for greater access and equality, including quality in education, healthcare, adequate housing, food, water, sanitation, and so on. So we are keen and will be delighted to work with you in those areas in the future. The two other points to respond to your question is one, which is very important and not always, successful, is continue to work with the right holders and bringing awareness of what they're entitled for. And how can we, the social workers and OHCHR, help them to exercise their rights and freedoms. So 2 areas to summarize. We have so many similarities. We can always explore the ways of where to tap into the opportunities and implement and help each other to bring a better life for people.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Just if you forgive me for a moment, Priska, I just want to first of all just acknowledge the people in the audience. I just want to briefly comment to our colleague from Hong Kong, and I want to affirm that IFSW absolutely supports the democracy movement in Hong Kong. We support you. We support all people's right to democracy, and that is a fundamental value of social work. And thank you for raising those issues with us. Was I heard?
Maybe
Okay.
The other thing is I just really want to acknowledge and thank the Indigenous social workers. You've played a major role in helping this profession transform from its past legacy that was combined and wrapped up with a colonial northern dominant perspective, and you've helped transform this profession so that we were able to have our first Indigenous theme, global theme, highest level theme in 2021 on Ubuntu, and this current year on Bougainvillea. I think for social work, it's not just about protecting Indigenous rights, it's about learning from Indigenous wisdom as we all work towards making the shift in the world that needs to be made for sustainability, for our ability to live in a positive relationship with nature and let that guide us in living in positive relationships with ourselves. So just thank you to those people in the room. Also to our colleagues from Aturo and Atina. It's wonderful to know that you are encouraging us as non-lawyers, as social workers, as practitioners, to participate and to engage and to work with Indigenous communities, so to bring action also from your end. What a partnership. That's really fantastic. So just to comment on Priska's, question, this brings us an end to this fantastic set of learning sessions and collaborations with your office. Thank you so much. I think we started off by noting in the very first session that we need each other, because you've got some fantastic instruments that are top down. Your customers are the member states, and you're exerting pressure and trying to get them to be accountable to the instruments and the conventions and the declarations that they've signed. We can also do that from the ground up, and together we can form a pincer maneuver. What I think I've learned from this environment is that we can bring to you something. We can bring to you on the ground stories. We can bring to you the experiences, the stories, the information, the hurt, the pain, and the successes, and acknowledging the strengths of what happens on the ground on the common areas of interest that we have. And we'd be really happy to do that. We think that's something that we can offer. We'd also really like to invite you to consider being a part of the development of our new commission, which is in defence of social workers' human rights. Now, we're developing this commission because we all have acknowledged that social workers are human rights defenders. And as a consequence, they're very often persecuted, imprisoned, tortured, and killed. And that's a global phenomenon. And we really need to protect human rights defenders. That's a big core part of our common strategy. So we'd really like to, as well as being able to offer you ground up, street talk action, to invite you, because we need your assistance in how to defend the human rights defenders in social work. Thank you. And thank you to Priska.
Welcome. But I have some more questions for you. So one of my colleagues from the IFSW Global Commissioners asked this wonderful question: could we set up a global community of practice between the organizations and run maybe quarterly CPD sessions involving global and regional commissioners and OHCHR? Would that be something you would support or?
CPD is going to professional
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, in theory, collaboration is very important. What forms of collaboration we need is something that we can discuss. Of course, the community of practice is one important area, but we're open for further discussion and see what sort of support we can provide. One challenge for us this year, and hope it looks like will be next year, is also is the financial situation. So we are in a very deep situation of crisis. Unfortunately, that will impede some of our initiatives, but we are very happy to sit down and discuss, put the plan, and see when and how soon we can implement. But we're open. Please come up with ideas, suggest, and we'll take it from there.
And so we can't help with financial challenges.
I'm not very good with my microphone, so just to repeat, we absolutely know that the world needs your office, and we can advocate along with you for proper resourcing. And yes, Priska, we'd be completely committed to continuing these processes. It's I think the participation, and you look at the world audience that's sitting with us today from all parts of the world, and we need all of you in this room. Someone's already volunteered to be a part of this commission, and I think that's fantastic. And the more people that can get involved with these CPDs, the more people that can offer further training in their own country or in their own region, we welcome all of that. So this is a successful formula, and we must continue. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, as a final question, a really challenging one, because we know from the UN, the latest development is that they are going to prepare a pact for the future that will be discussed in September in New York. The civil society meeting has taken place just a few days ago in Nairobi, and a colleague of us could join that meeting. So one of the 5 topics they now have in for this Pact of the Future for the UN is transforming global governance. That is one of the themes, and they really speak about changing the system, changing the political system, and one of the topics is strengthening the human rights pillar of the organizations. And so I wonder, if you think of having this transforming global governance, and now we look on social work relation to OHCHR, I wonder what wish you have for this transformation, how that should be, like just having started this collaboration here. And also Arturo, you can also say something on that.
To start with, I think it is important that we acknowledge that many things that we invented over the history, and including in the history of the United Nations systems, needs an update. If we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, from Goal 1 to Goal 10, there's so many things that we committed, but we have significantly failed. I'm talking about the entire global community. Poverty has gone down to the level that did not exist before. While we made significant progress in science, technology, communication, and so on, but the matters that relate to people's life on a daily basis are the most challenging. Right? The investment in healthcare system is not there as much as it is needed. Millions of children, not only in war zone countries, but also in countries in the global south, have no access to education. And there is significant lack of investment in human rights. When we say human rights, we don't only talk about negative obligations. There's one part that states should not do, like should not torture, should not imprison, should not detain human rights defenders. There are so many positive parts, like they should protect individuals' rights, they should invest in education, they should invest in social security, and so on. So that's one. Second, the reform is needed because many countries that you belong, I belong, and countries around here are suffering from debt distress. Debt distress is one of the biggest challenge of the 21st century. So that is that the income countries make is used to pay their interest, the loan of the interest of their loan. They borrow from the international financial institutions. Third, we have focused so much on productions, but not well-being of people. The production is great. Many countries and individuals have been reached, but has it changed people's life? How do we have access that we wanted? So these are all these questions that we are reflecting now. Right? This is a very important time. And then internally speaking, there's been a lot more attention on peace and security than human rights. And the fact that peace and security and human rights are so interconnected that it is not possible to separate one from other. It's important to invest in all these areas and prioritize all these areas. So these are big issues. We're trying to stimulate discussions. I think your role is very, very important. Your solidarity is very important. And where you can influence by providing data, figures, and conversation around these issues that we face every day in our life will be very, very important. We really hope that there will be changes in the months to come, hopefully next year. But the changes are the most needed changes given the current global situation. Thank you.
So if the question's about thinking for the future and what does good global governance look like, I think from an IFSW perspective, we agree with all of those comments. We also highlight the need for major transformational change in the world. we've engaged with many other partners representing hundreds of millions of people in the last couple of years on the People's Global Summit, which produced a charter, the People's Charter for a New Eco-Social World, which articulated that governments and states are not designed to cooperate. They're not, their function is actually competitive and dominant and growth orientated for themselves. So we actually need a new world system. And this might sound very big, it might sound very far-fetched, but it is a conversation we have to have, because our sustainability and the sustainability of all other species and beings and on the planet also depends on this conversation taking place. And I think this conversation is taking place in many communities already, not just with professionals. We see people in communities all over the place, not waiting for their government to start acting sustainably, they're doing it themselves. So we see a huge need for power to be transferred to people. Because when people get together and they build relationships with each other, they don't want to have war. They don't want to see other people living in poverty. They want their children to be able to be living in a fair and a society which is safe and they feel secure. That's the concerns of people. Doesn't matter which culture. That's what they want for themselves. So somehow, when we talk about global governance, when we get to this forum that you're talking about, Priska, I think the social work message is transform, transform, transform. Let's do it together.
Mm-hmm.
Let's do it together.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you.
Okay. Would you want to say something? Or is
Sure. No, I totally agree that we need a new world system. And as Pradeep was saying, it's sad to see the reality. As you know, the three main pillars of the United Nations are development, peace, and human rights. And unfortunately, human rights is the one that has the less budget. This is a reflect of the real importance. I totally agree that we need a new world social system in which development is based on human rights and where the human being and the human life is the center of the approach. Unfortunately, we're currently living in a system where profit and exploitation and colonial practices are still alive. That's why it also comes very close to the heart of the indigenous people's rights. So unfortunately, currently we're living in a system in which the economy is also changing to be an economy of war, in which basically human life and human beings are not relevant, but what is relevant is to business, and business is coming from an economy of war. So this is totally contrary to what we are trying to achieve. The Secretary General is calling for a new world order, including human rights and economy, and of course the protection of economic, social, and cultural rights, and civil and political rights. But this requires a total change of paradigm, and it's not easy because unfortunately economic interests are still above human rights. As long as this continues like this, I don't think that there will be any substantive change. So we have a long way to go. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful, powerful final word, right? Isn't it? Is it not like that? And we all have to contribute to achieve this change that we are looking for. Thank you all for your contribution. Thank you for your support. And thanks also Mayaka and Pascal, who were in the backside. You couldn't see them. They helped me with setting up the meetings and then sending all this information to you. You will get another email later on this week with all the recorded sessions, and then also an opportunity to get a certificate for those who attended at least 2 sessions. They can then by approaching this link get a certificate. We also have seen some interest of people who want to get closer with the IFSW. So I've sent you this link that you can join our newsletter. But also you have the opportunity to become a member of a commission. So especially in Asia Pacific, we are now looking to extend the UN Commission's team. So all of you are welcome to check the opportunities right there. Thank you all for being with us, joining these sessions, and some of you look the recorded version later on. We had more than 500 people who registered, and we look forward to continue with this course. I think with that we're coming to an end. Wish you all a wonderful time and stay connected with IFSW. Stay connected with OHCHR. For me, that was a wonderful experience to work that close with OHCHR. And I'm looking so much forward to build up on that. Thank you all. So we have now here the leaders in these two organizations, and I hope that we can have a picture later on. But thank you so much for sitting here on this table together and showing all the people, all the social workers around the world, all of those who are looking those later on, showing that you see the connections and you want to work together. Thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you. Oh, well done. Thank you so much.